I wanted to tell a story that wasn't, straightforwardly a story about heroes and villains, that got at the real moral complexity and contradictions, and that I think, our trickster traditions have always created the space for it.
I'm Nathan Maharaj, and this is Kobo in Conversation. My guest is the Oscar-nominated filmmaker and journalist Julian Brave NoiseCat. His 2024 documentary, Sugarcane, investigated abuses at a residential school in Western Canada, though, and I'm reading this straight from his bio, it's really a, quote, reverse Western buddy stoner road trip tragic comedy, unquote. I recently watched it and I will enthusiastically co-sign that description, but it's a lot more than that too. He is also, though, the author of a new book. It's called We Survived the Night, an Indigenous Reckoning. It's about his dad, and it's also about his upbringing, and there's a lot about somebody named Coyote, and I just can't wait to get into it. Julian Brave NoiseCat, welcome to Kobo.
Thanks so much for having me.
I kind of dodged the task of describing your book, We Survived the Night, because it's many things. It is memoir, it's journalism, it is myth. I hope I could start by asking you how you describe it.
It's nonfiction. I think it's first and foremost, it's dealing with the truth about what it is to be an Indigenous person today, beginning with the personal and expanding out into a continent-wide portrait of contemporary Native life. And it's trying to do that also in an Indigenous way, at least a way that's true to my people and our cultural context and the way that we've told stories since the beginning, which is, it's bringing back to life on the page the coyote stories, which are a form of trickster narrative about the creation of the world and why things are the way they are, that are told through stories about one of our first ancestors, a guy called Coyote, who was sent to the earth by Creator to set things in order, but who was a trickster. And so at the same time as he did a lot of good, he was often up to no good. And through the coyote and the stories about him, the ideas in those stories, I talk about myself, about my dad, about my grandfather, our family, and the broader native world that I've moved through. And I think, it's just worth saying in this particular moment in time that it's hard not to see the world as one that is still roiled by tricksters and their tricks today.
The book begins with an origin story. Um, it's not the origin story of the world. It's not the origin story of Coyote. It's the origin story of your dad. Uh, can you tell us that story of how you began the book with the beginning of your dad's life?
My father was born and discovered in the trash incinerator at St. Joseph's Mission, the Indian residential school that my family was sent to unlearn our Indian ways.
Mm.
And it's a story that my family does not tell. It's one that he actually did not know until I set about writing We Survived the Night and making the documentary Sugarcane. And it's ultimately a story of survival because he entered this world. He was born also at the precipice of death. And I think that that story to me, while being obviously a very personal, troubling, familial story that has shaped my life and is a very important story in my family now, um, I also think it gets at what it is to be a Native person, what it is to face the existential questions of survival as a people who were nearly wiped out and whose way of life remains imperiled.
Yeah. You allude to the boy who lived in the book. You're alluding to Harry
Harry
Potter,
Potter,
an
yeah.
an important figure.
Important figure in the mythology of my generation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, like right. There's Coyote, there's Harry Potter, there's a pantheon. But it occurs to me that as you tell your dad's story, part of what is so heartbreaking is, we think of the Harry Potter story. There are parents in the frame of that picture. There are people around, and yes, his parents are taken from him, but but at least they're there. And as you tell your dad's story, he's alone as alone gets, and only the school's night watchman Tony is present, and that feels. I was struck by both just the pathos of it, just like how my heart broke for this infant, and how I was just so glad. Tony happened upon upon the shoebox because surely it had happened other times and there was no Tony.
Mhm.
But it feels mythical. Did it feel mythical to write? Am I making too much am I making too much of this of the striking scene?
Well, I think one detail in the scene that made it even more striking to me was that the night watchman, Tony Stoop, described my father's cries for life as sounding like the noise of a cat, which
Mm.
is remarkable to me because, of course, my last name is NoiseCat, but even more remarkable because NoiseCat was not originally pronounced noise cat. That is actually a missionary's bastardization of one of my family's ancestral names, NoiseCat, which was the last name of my great grandmother, the woman who actually raised my father after he was saved from the incinerator, Alice NoiseCat. And when my dad married my mom, he in either party in a marriage can actually legally change their name, and so he was the one who decided to change his name and to reclaim that ancestral name, NoiseCat, which we didn't even know had this story that had found him and his name of how his cries for life had actually sounded like the noise of a cat. So, there's something in there about Indian names and meaning and life and survival. And I think beyond that, when you are writing a story that has to do with your people and their connections and your own life and the connections to ancestors, and in some instances, those who have gone on, questions of life, death, spirits in the spirit world, I think that you inherently have to engage in storytelling traditions that take non-secular approaches to telling stories seriously, And I think in that way, We Survive the Night is, while it engages in hard-hitting journalism, while it includes, significant pieces of memoir and criticism, ultimately the tradition that it is bringing back to life, the nonfiction tradition, I should say, that it's bringing back to life, is the storytelling traditions of my own people who have often left open, the possibility that agencies and forces beyond ourself, of ancestors, of spirits, of tricksters, are still present in the world and are sometimes still shaping and guiding and influencing current events.
Mm. Just as an aside, my surname is similarly a bastardization. There's a bunch of Maharajas throughout South Africa. They did not arrive as Maharajas. They got named that by the Dutchman on the pier making notes. So
Yeah.
yeah, it always interests me to see people like the break in the name in their the timeline of their heritage.
What happened in my people's neck of the woods is one of our ancestors would have been like one of my family's names is Archie. So what would have happened way back in time, like in the 1800s, one of our ancestors would have been baptized as Archie, and then all of his kids would have gotten that name. And then in other instances, maybe you owned a ranch and you were employing local native guys to, help run your cattle. And you'd stick sort of a white name on the native guy whose name you could not pronounce because, Noiskit might be a little bit challenging for you. So then that one might become like Indian Jim or something, and
Yeah,
then all of their ancestors, all their descendants would become Jims.
yeah. So you write in this book, quote, "In my world, my father is Coyote. He's mythic and elusive, a great creator, a terrible demolisher, and downright hilarious hellraiser." So we're going to talk about your dad because we're going to talk about this book, but we got to start with Coyote. You told us of his trickster nature, but can you give us a sense for the reader who hasn't yet delved into this book? Who is Coyote?
Well, it's a great question because when I started writing the book, I actually didn't know who Coyote really was either. I'd heard of him, but I had only ever heard one Coyote story told out loud by a member of my family once in my entire life. Just to give your listeners a sense for the extent to which this tradition really was nearly wiped off the face of the earth. And the one family member who I heard tell the Coyote story was like an uncle who was one of my grandfather's many sort of stray kids, which gets back to the Coyote story. I'll circle back around to that. But I decided also to write the book because so much of it has to do with my relationship to my father, who is my connection to my native family and community and identity. My mother's an Irish Jewish New Yorker, so I'm a child of two worlds. And my dad left when I was about 6 years old, and so my connection to him and my culture and my identity was sort of broken and in question from a very young age. And so that's part of why I think I became a storyteller, because I was always trying to, you know, figure out the broader native world so that I could also figure out myself. And what I did to write the book is I decided that I needed to, if I was going to go all the way there with my relationship to my dad and our story, I needed to actually live with the guy again because we
Mm.
hadn't lived together since I was a little kid. So at the age of 28, a bachelor living on the East Coast with a whole career already started, I made the probably pretty unusual decision to move back in with, the dad, the trickster dad, who still owed me the money that I loaned him so that he could come to my own high school graduation. And suddenly we were living across the hallway from each other, and he'd be out in the studio during the day making his artwork, and I'd be sitting at this computer, writing my book and working on my documentary Sugarcane. And at night, we'd come together and he'd tell me, I'd turn on the recorder and we'd hang out and we'd smoke a little something and play some games and eat. And he would, tell me different stories about his life that I had never really heard before. And then, I'd share a little bit about my own. And through that way, we became a lot closer. At the same time as that was happening and I was learning more about my father's story, I spent my days doing lots of research and reporting for this book. And one of the things that I, felt moved to do because I was working on this documentary about the Indian residential school that my family was sent to and that had, cut me and my people off from so much of our language and our culture and traditions was to look into the storytelling traditions of my own people, some of which had been gathered up in old ethnographies that are now over 100+ years old. Nobody reads these. Um, and I kept, circling around to probably the largest body of oral histories that were collected, and definitely the most popular, which are the coyote stories, which are these trickster narratives about one of our ancestors who, as I said, was sent to the earth by the creator to set things in order and created just as much disorder as he did order. And what I found was that what I felt and found as I was reading these stories about this great creator and destroyer, this sort of epic deadbeat dad who had also made the world as it was that there was so many parallels between the trickster and my own father and his father as well. Because one of the things about Coyote is that he's kind of the forefather of our people. He, in the beginning of time, populated the lands with descendants because he was a bit of a womanizer. He was always out for his own, he was kind of governed by his id,
Yeah.
Coyote. So, for example, the uncle the one uncle who had ever heard tell a coyote story was actually the son, one of the stray sons of my grandfather, a man who fathered at least 19 children that I could name and helped bring our people back, from a genocide. He played a disproportionate role in helping our people, resurge. And, in that way, like the coyote stories also, I think, captured this truth that I felt, very innately in my own family. And then, also the truth of the broader native world and the world beyond that.
Yeah. And I just want listeners to know, like, we're not talking about, this is not the coyote stories as you tell them. They're bawdy, they're funny, they're surprising, tragic. Like it's all there.
That's what
Coyote.
makes them memorable. If you need to pass down important teachings to your kids, you're not going to lecture to them. They're not going to remember that stuff. So the humor and the entertainment value of the story is also part of what makes it memorable, which makes, the parts that are important for people to pass down for literally thousands of years. Sometimes we're talking, um, you know, that's what made them stick.
Yeah, yeah. There are so many stories of coyote in this, and they're woven through. They're like it's almost like it's the infrastructure of the book or coyote stories, and then your story is sort of like hung upon the rebar of it. You
Mhm.
don't hang anything on rebar. Clearly, I've never built anything. But
I picked up what you were putting down.
I appreciate that. Well, it's not structurally sound, so you should put it back. Anyway, so there are so many stories, and as you say, you started with like the seed of it is that you heard one coyote's story once, if I heard you correctly.
Mhm.
Can you tell me about the process of picking up all of those other stories that make their way into the pages of your book?
Well, I always thought about the book as being a woven work. And I thought about it that way very purposefully because my people, the Secwepemc and Statlink, were Salish peoples. And to us, the highest art form, despite the sort of Western dismissal of weaving as a feminine craft, is actually weaving.
Mm,
My great grandmother, Kichya, was a master basket weaver, and there are some of her pieces in the Cultural Museum of the Liwat Nation. Her mother, my great great grandmother Julia Kraus Peters, has some pieces in the Museum of Anthropology in at UBC in Vancouver. I went and checked one of them out before, and so I wanted to honor that tradition. They're basically in the book, implicitly or explicitly. I wanted to honor these pieces of my own people and family's traditions that have, almost been lost. There are no weavers in my family anymore, for
mm.
example. There are no coyote storytellers left in my family. My uncle who told that story is now no longer with us. And I wanted to help them, because I think so many Native people feel this imperative of helping to bring our people back in the wake of this cultural genocide to come back to life on the page. And in so doing, I also wanted to show that this tradition that was dismissed, that was considered backwards, that has been written off as nothing more than legends and fables and fairy tales, actually still gets at not just the truth of my family, which I think, is to me quite evident, um, but also the truth of the native world more broadly, and actually gets at ideas that I think the humanities and literature and philosophy, have never taken seriously, but it's high time that they ought to. I think that it's ridiculous that you can, go through an entire process of higher education in North America and learn about Plato and Aristotle and John Locke and Michel Foucault, and nobody really understands what Foucault says anyways. But like, and not have to grapple with this this immense body of stories and ideas and wisdom that stretches back thousands of years before the Bible. Like for example, in one of the coyote stories that structures the book, the second one, it's called Coyote Steals the Salmon. There's a story about how Coyote breaks this dam and leads the salmon up the river. And one of the fascinating things about that, well, firstly, the story of people hoarding a whole bunch of fish and keeping them to themselves has an obvious environmental and moral dimension that's really important and still relevant in a world where we are catching and killing all of the fish way too quickly. But also, the place where we situate that dam in the oral history is the same place where geologists will tell you there was once an ice dam 11,000 years ago that held up this series of glacial lakes in the interior of what is now British Columbia that did break 11,000 years ago and formed the present course eventually of the Fraser River. So within this coyote story, there is this 11,000-year-old memory, this memory in human life that stretches way before, the writing of the Bible and way back before the pyramids and stuff that we pass down orally generation to generation. And I think that if people were that committed to conveying these pieces of knowledge about the land and about how we should live with one another and upon the land, maybe a crazy idea, we should actually consider listening to it.
I am struck by the durability of what is essentially information technology. We don't commonly refer to oral tradition that way, but the techniques of narrating these stories clearly bears out in the fact that they can sustain over millennia, that this the information to be conveyed exists in geological time. It's not lost on me that part of the colonial project included the dismantling of occasions of sharing these traditions, of outlawing the potlatch, of eradicating language. Can you tell me a little bit about your journalism of diving into the systemic practices around around erasure, I guess.
That was actually the place where the process of writing the book really truly began. This coyote stories were a discovery that I had in the process of writing the book that I was, drawn to because I was thinking so much about the residential schools and the traditions that they had killed. But my background was actually as a journalist. So I had traveled for the last decade, all over Canada and the United States, reporting stories for magazines and newspapers about contemporary Indigenous life that I thought got at, these dimensions of what it is to be Native and what's going on out there in Indian country that were also instructive to broader society about, what it is to be a Canadian, what it is to be American, what it is to be a person who lives in North America. So, for
Mhm.
example, I had the opportunity to profile the first ever Indigenous Governor General of Canada, Mary Simon, an Inuit woman whose, story of her rise to become the first ever embodiment of the sovereign who is Indigenous, which is such an interesting contradiction, by the way, to have an Indigenous person become the representative of like the most imperial institution you could probably imagine in the history of the world, was actually a story that pointed to the success of her people and their movement, the Inuit, to steadily reshape Canadian sovereignty and ultimately also international affairs in the Arctic, a swath of history that goes back over 50 years, in which Mary Simon was actually one of the primary protagonists. And so I think if you look at across the Indigenous world, there are all of these unknown and not particularly well told or seen stories that get at not just what it is to be a Native person and not just parts of our past, but actually also, fundamental and insightful things about our present. And it just drives me up a wall that people continue to write Indigenous peoples out of the story, continue to marginalize us because, these stories, I think, lend insight, but they also, on an even more basic level, they tend to be like fairly entertaining. Like if you hang out in any like living room across the country, you're going to hear some of the most outrageous, hard, insightful, hilarious stories that you've ever heard. And so from a pure entertainment value, the fact that, our people and our stories continue to be sort of sidelined in the story of this place, I think is a disservice to people who care about story.
It absolutely is. And I'm mindful of how so often the way that's done is by referring to indigenous peoples in a past tense,
Mhm.
often like a revered kind of thing, but it's easy to revere someone who's not there because they don't ask difficult questions or anything. This book feels very much like a very forceful present. It's very much about the now. Yes, there's the past, but it's very much about the past has informed a present, and it's not just about the past. Can you tell me about that connecting to the now?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for that insight. I think that there is this sort of way that Indigenous stories are often told that sidelines us, that puts us into a past tense,
Hmm.
that, assumes that the era when Indigenous peoples had influence over events ended, at best in the late 1800s. And I think that, if you look at stories of political leaders like Mary Simon, but also of First Nations and Indigenous peoples all across Canada and the United States, I think that there are numerous examples wherein Native people are the drivers of the plot,
Mhm.
And for example, in the book, I traveled to Bella Coola, British Columbia, which is a really interesting part of the Canadian story because among other things, it's the first place where a white man crossed the continent north of Mexico. This guy named Sir Alexander Mackenzie made it to the Pacific at Bella Coola in 1793. And, just to like get at the Canadianness of this story for a second, Americans love to make a big deal about Lewis and Clark, but Lewis and Clark crossed the continent near what is now Portland, Oregon, which is a major metropolis.
Mhm.
Bella Coola, British Columbia has like less than 10,000 residents to this day and is like a very rugged place. So it was a much more, you know, it was a much more significant accomplishment to have crossed the continent in this place. But how did he do it? He did it by, following these grease trails that native people, the Dakheth, some of my people's neighbors, developed to trade. And today, what is really interesting is that in Bella Coola, in many other places along the Pacific coast of Canada, the Newhalk Nation, other First Nations as well, are reclaiming their ancestral governance system, their hereditary way that they have long governed and protected their territories and their rights as part of a broader strategy to protect the rainforest and then therefore to help in the fight against climate change. And so here, there's often this assumption in the story about, climate change and how we're going to address it, that it involves, things like electric vehicles and, rare earth minerals. And, those things are obviously important. I'm not saying that they're not. But there is also this other unknown and very interesting story about the ways that First Nations and indigenous peoples across North America and around the world are reviving some of these ancestral forms of governance, of
Mhm.
power, of culture, and using them to, be part of a broader human effort to take on some of the greatest challenges of our time. And Native people are rarely ever get to be seen in that kind of a light as people who are leading in some of the most significant issues of our time. More often, we are portrayed as, people who are struggling with, death and addiction and things that are real, but, that I think do a disservice to the full breadth and richness of our story.
I want to shift if we can talk about your dad and how you tell his story in this book. His stories should be plural because there's so much. Maybe starting with was it difficult to reconcile your experience of him as a parent and who he is as an individual? You know how it is with parents. They are who they are, but they are also who you need them to be, and the difference between them can be really painful.
Well, my dad was always a huge part of my life in a sort of contradictory way. Listen, I'm half native, but I ended up looking, I got long hair, I got brown skin. I have about as Indian a name as you can get, Julian Brave NoiseCat. And, my dad was a significant native artist. He was pictured on the cover of Native People's magazine when I was a little kid, wearing a backwards Kangol hat and purple rock star shades. He was a, to me, and not just to me, kind of a legendary mythic type figure. And that was before I even knew about the stuff about his birth and his upbringing and all that sort of stuff. And so to be the child of this legendary Indian artist and also an Irish Jewish woman from New York, and for my father to have left, was a fundamental thing that always shaped my life and who I was, and that put me in this situation of being without the father who connected me to his family, to the res that he comes from, and where I'm a band member, Canham Lake, and to this broader culture and identity that I wear on my person, whether I, wanted to or not. And I always did want to, but it was, it created all this sets of questions and this sense of, loss, which I think is a thing that so many native people feel about ourselves with respect to our families and our culture. I think that all of us in some way, shape, or form often wish that we could be more native in a particular way. We wish we were better at speaking our language. We wish we
Mhm.
were more present in our ceremonial lives. We wish we were more present in the life of our community. We wish we were better hunters, better fishermen. We're constantly telling stories as native people about how great our ancestors were, which is our way of looking at the world, but also can sometimes make us feel a little bit inadequate. Um, and I was sort of grappling with all of that, and therefore set out to tell these stories about native life across the continent, and also to sort of figure out myself. And ultimately, despite the pain, and the bit of harm that my father caused in my life, I always found him to be also this, incredible artist and this
Mhm.
really like lovable, charismatic guy. And I was always, I think, looking for a way to convey that truth to other people. I also, I think, was lucky in that I turned out like I'm not undamaged, but like, I'm all right, I think. I mean, I don't
Mm.
know, I guess you can be the judge of that. But I
I'm
think
in no
that
position to judge that. Yeah.
but I think that the coyote stories, what was so amazing about this revelation that I had about the coyote stories is that they gave me a language to understand my patriarch and to understand other Native men in my life, which I assume was also what they were meant to do for countless generations of Native kids like me going back, way into time.
Yeah.
And also, at the same time as if you're working on a documentary and a book that engage very seriously with and reckon with the history of the cultural genocide and the separation of multiple generations of Native kids from their parents, it's hard to hold against someone their inability to parent because that was a right that was deprived of an entire race of people for over 100 years. And so, while I wish my dad knew how to be a better dad to me and my little sister, at the end of the day, I can't fully hold it against him because, like, he didn't really have parents, and his parents didn't really have parents either.
Yeah. Yeah. You also, in talking about Coyote as an explanatory story for the men in your life and presumably your ancestors' lives, you also talk about how you see yourself as you kind of wear the coyote.
Mhm.
Can you talk a little bit about what that feels like? Because as you say, you didn't grow up with a rich sense of it. So as you learned, was it like just resonant of like, oh, there's me again?
I think so, yeah. And I also think that sometimes when you pick up some of these elements of our culture and our traditions, like they do have a power in life in their own. And I think that there has been an element of like picking it up and trying it on that then makes it more true in your life in a way, if that
Yeah.
makes sense. But I would say that I wanted to get at hard, sometimes funny, but real truths about my family, my father, my grandfather, and the broader native world. I wanted to tell a story that wasn't, straightforwardly a story about heroes and villains that got at the real moral complexity and contradictions that exist out in the world more broadly, and that I think, our trickster traditions have always created the space for. I mean, like, of course, in the story, the coyote is the figure who led the salmon up the river, feeding your people for all eternity. And also, you know, he used the salmon to marry into all the communities and was a terrible womanizer, and then he abandoned all of us. So like it's both at the
Yeah.
same time. And he's in all of the stories, an example to the kids of how exactly you should not behave. Um, and I think that I wanted to, I took on my dad, I took on my grandfather, I took on so many other different people and realities out there in the native world. I think, if I was going to do that, I needed to be willing to take on myself.
Hmm.
And I think that, I have had my own fair share of of struggles, as the child of two worlds, as someone who faces real legal questions about whether my children will be counted as Indian under the Indian Act, for example, because I am a 6'2" Indian under the Indian Act, which means that unless I have kids with another Indian under the Indian Act, my kids will not be counted as native. And I also wanted to be honest about like some of like the interesting thing about writing about my dad to me is like Coyote, he was always kind of my example of how not to be. Like, I
Hmm.
think so many of us, we don't want to make the same mistakes that our parents made. And yet, I found myself in my 20s repeating not all of the mistakes that my dad made. I haven't had kids and like left them behind. But, I struggled with alcoholism. I also, struggled to have healthy and respectful relationships to women. I was a bit of a player or womanizer, however you want to say it, myself. And, my grandfather was like the ultimate of those things. And so when I was telling these stories about these men in my life
Hmm.
who really fundamentally shaped our family and my world, my personal world, I also wanted to be, real about about me and about the trickster parts of myself.
Yeah.
It only felt fair.
um, your mom is also really important. And you talk about her in this book too. Um, I personally, I just thought she just comes across as such a remarkable person for
Mm,
how dedicated she clearly was to maintaining your connections to your heritage. I mean, there's a world in which your parents separate, and she's like, okay, that's it. I just got to raise this kid, and I'm just going to do it the best I can with in a comfortable framework. She put her. It felt like she was driven to put herself in whatever situation was required for the benefit of your connection to this heritage, which is of course troubled because it's a heritage that was subject to violence.
mhm.
At what point did it kind of dawn on you that your upbringing was so remarkable because this Irish Jewish white lady went to these lengths to keep those connections for you?
Yeah, the book is dedicated to my mom, and sometimes I struggle to talk about her because I just love her so much. And it's also like she has really been this enormous, like loving figure in just my life. And I think sometimes when someone is that all encompassing for you, it can sometimes be hard to have perspective.
Yeah.
But for me, for example, I chose to be a writer. That's part of what I do. I make movies and I write books right now. And my mom was always the one who encouraged me to read and write. Ever since I was a little kid, she's been my editor. She's still my first reader and editor to this day. She put Sherman Alexie's books in my hands, and she encouraged me to write, Sherman Alexie fan fiction when I was like 11 or 12 years old. Um, she put me in the car and would drive me all the way, over 24 hours from Oakland, California, where I grew up, to Cannon Lake, British Columbia. It is truly over a 24-hour journey by car, very rural and also kind of dangerous drive, to visit her ex's family. It
Yeah.
was a pretty unusual decision. She brought me down to the Intertribal Friendship House on International Boulevard in East Oakland. She learned how to bead so that I could have my own powwow regalia. It's so many turns. And I've asked her about this. It was not necessarily something that she planned out, but it felt to her something instinctual. She wanted to make sure that I had this connection and this opportunity to have a connection to my family and my culture and my identity, because she knew that if that was broken off, that when I came of age, when I was an adult, I would have really complicated feelings about all that. And I think that I still struggle, of course, with questions of identity and self and all those sorts of things. But I think that she made it possible for me to have connections that otherwise would not have existed for me. And I think on the other side of that, my dad's family, and I think this is true of Native people all over the place, were incredibly welcoming and saw what she was doing and love her and loved her for it. My aunties and uncles still call her sister. My cousins all call her auntie. There is a incredibly warm and loving embrace. I mean, like, for example, I went home this summer to the Cannon Lake Indian Reserve for a fast pitch softball tournament, and everybody was like, "Where's your mom?" And I was like, "What am I like? Am I not good enough?" And I love that. I
Yeah.
really do love that, and so that's why the book is dedicated to her.
Can I ask more about powwow dancing? Because you were no joke. You are because I'm not actually sure where the powwow dancing stands in your life right now. Because one of my favorite scenes in Sugarcane is where you're in the parking lot packing up. After you figure you did okay at a competition, like it was fine, whatever, and you were pretty sure you're out of it, and then they call your name and you realize, oh no, I gotta go be somewhere right now because apparently I made it to the next round. Where is powwow dancing in your life now, and how important was that to you growing up?
Yeah, I took first place actually at the Kamloopa powwow in the film, which is kind of a nice little coup to have counted in the movie, because Kamloopa is like the big powwow, biggest Indian celebration probably in the entire province of British Columbia. I still love to dance. I still travel to powwows when I can. Unfortunately, with my writing and filmmaking and just life more broadly, it's harder to do that as much as I would like to.
Yeah.
But I do still hit the powwow trail. And it is like still my absolute favorite thing to do. Being in the circle and dance circle is the place where I feel the greatest amount of joy. And I do actually still get to go out and dance and also compete. So this summer I was at the Kamloops powwow, which is still one of the biggest powwows in Canada, and I placed at that powwow. And then I went on this big road trip with my partner. And on the beginning of the road trip, we went over to the Tsuut'ina annual celebration just outside of Calgary. So we went across the Rocky Mountains from BC, and there was a big men's traditional special over there. And for folks who really know Indian country and the Powwow Trail, like the Alberta and Saskatchewan Indians, the Flatlanders, they're kind of like that's like the epicenter of powwow, like the Plains native culture.
Mm.
And I went over there and I took second place in their big men's traditional special. They're
A
one of their champion dancers, a guy named Bobby Hunter from I think Saddle Lake, beat me, but I still got it, man. I still got some moves.
I am so glad I gave you the opportunity to flex that. I've read that you say you feel like more of a writer than a filmmaker, which I mean, speaking of flexes, that's pretty impressive because you are an Oscar nominated filmmaker.
Or
How
maybe a curse. I don't know. Maybe my writing will never live up to the accidental film that happened to me.
I mean, it still sounds like a pretty interesting artistic life, given, chasing that particular rabbit. I wonder though, how did making Sugarcane, your film, shape this book? How did the book shape the movie? Because I actually couldn't work out the timeline of what were you working on when and how did it all come out?
So what ended up happening is that I had just signed the contract for We Survived the Night when my co-director for Sugarcane, Emily Cassie, reached out and said she wanted to work with me on a documentary about Indian residential schools. She's Canadian, grew up in Toronto, is Jewish, so it was a subject that really called her. We'd
Mm.
sat next to each other at our first reporting jobs. I had just signed a book contract, never written a book in my life, never made a film of any length, not even like a TikTok. And so I had to think about it, right? So I went and thought about it for a couple of weeks, and she, found a First Nation that was going to lead its own search. When I called her back and said, "Hey, I'd be open to working with you," she told me that she'd identified a First Nation leading its own search, and that search was happening at St. Joseph's Mission near Williams Lake. And when she said that, I was completely floored, as you might imagine, because that's the school that my family was sent to, and where, to the best of my knowledge at the time, my father was born and found abandoned in a dumpster nearby. And from that moment, the projects, you don't have to watch Sugarcane to read We Survived the Night. You don't
Mhm.
have to read We Survived the Night to watch Sugarcane, but they inevitably, obviously, influenced each other. And I think the biggest conceptual way is that Sugarcane, broadly speaking, is about the system that nearly killed off my people and our way of life. And We Survived the Night is very consciously trying to bring back to life, some of our storytelling traditions, which I think are important to us, but also have something to say more broadly to the discipline of nonfiction and storytelling and the humanities more broadly than that. But I think also, Sugarcane and We Survived the Night, I think there are qualities that they share in common, even though they are different storytelling mediums. The first is that if you read my prose and if you also watch the way that we put together Sugarcane, I'm a believer in a form of sort of dense minimalism, if that makes sense. Like I
Mm.
think that you want to in storytelling and in language, I think that you often want to convey the most that you can with the least amount of words or the least amount of information that you can. The Mark Twain quote on this is like, if I had more time, I would have said it shorter or so written it shorter or something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
And so there is a quality of that, I think, across these two projects. I think the other is that, the process of putting together a film, we were editing Sugarcane at the same time as I was getting towards a full draft of We Survived the Night, really showed me that you can, once you have your material all written and stuff, you can cut it up and reweave it back together, like not endless amounts of times, but many different ways and times. And I think that helped me, especially because as writers, I think we get really attached to our words and the way that we put them dodown on the paper. At least I know
Mm.
I sometimes do when I do a draft of writing. That really was instructive to me because it showed me like, oh, like, when you're making a film, like you can cut it up and put it back together like umpteen different ways to figure out the one way that works the best. And similarly, because I was trying to weave together different threads to make We Survive the Night work as one piece, that liberated me to try to figure out, with my editor and with myself, all the ways that I could try to reweave this thing together so that it would hold together, as one woven story, which
Mm.
again, weaving, a Salish trait.
Late in the book, you write that you're afraid of telling stories that will hurt the people they're about because they're people you love. I wonder how present that fear is to you now. Is that diminished over time at all?
It has diminished a bit over time, now that sugarcane has come out into the world and it was so well received by the world and by my own family. That fear has diminished a bit. But I would say that fear also called me to do another thing that was really essential, I think, to both projects, but especially to We Survived the Night, which was to take on greater spiritual and ceremonial commitments in the life of my own people and nation. Very briefly, during the 4 years that I wrote We Survived the Night and directed Sugarcane, I also committed to a ceremonial fast for 4 days and 4 nights with no food and no water during the solstice for 4 years in a row, which is one of my people's and many other people's most ancient forms of ceremony. It's a way that we seek spiritual power and guidance and purpose. And for me, what I was always praying for when I was out there was that these hard stories that I was setting out to tell, stories that, were so hard that my own family did not tell them,
Mm.
would be gentle with the people who I love and who I ultimately tell stories about and for. And I do believe that intention, which was also there in the writing and crafting of the stories themselves, um, has helped to make it possible to do what has felt at times like a really dangerous thing, which is to tell stories essentially about your family's trauma and secrets.
My last question is about the book's title, We Survived the Night. As you write it, it's kind of a translation of a greeting. Please, can you talk a little bit about the title?
So We Survived the Night is derived from the way that we give the morning greeting in Secwepemctsín, my people's language, which now has only two remaining fluent speakers on the Cannon Lake Indian Reserve. And in Secwepemctsín, we say Chuchwinuk, which doesn't actually translate to like good morning. It literally means you survived the night. And I have often wondered what it was for my ancestors to greet one another in the day with the simple yet profound acknowledgement that, we're still here. I wonder what it was for my ancestors to say that to each other in the winter of 1863 when 2/3 of our nation succumbed to smallpox. What was it in the days after the children were taken away in cattle trucks to the residential schools for our elders to say Chuchwinuk to each other? And then I also, think about the kind of wry and tragicomic sense of humor that put Chuchwinuk on my grandmother's coffee mug, and which she would grab and put tea into before every language lesson, over 10 years ago when I was living on the Cannon Lake Res and learning our language. In the film, actually, at the very end, the last scene, one of the hardest scenes in the film, if you listen really carefully, when I walk into my Kia's house, I say, Chuchwina Kia, and she says, "Oh, don't remind me," which is such like a, witty and like true to the quick-witted and like funny sensibility of my people who, there's deep poetry in this language that is dying. There is social commentary, and there's also, a little bit of dark humor. And I think that the reason why I always knew that my first book would be called We Survived the Night was that I wanted to bring all of that full sensibility that is, germane to us to the page.
Yeah. Julian, thank you so much for joining us.
Sam, thank you so much for having me, man. I really love this conversation.
I have been speaking with Julian Brave NoiseCat, author of We Survived the Night, an Indigenous Reckoning. Find it at Kobo and Conversation's home on the web. That's kobo.com/conversation. There's a link in the show notes. Follow in your podcast player to catch every episode. And if you enjoyed this one, 5 stars is a wonderful way to show it. Kobo in Conversation was produced and hosted this time by me, Nathan Maharaj. Thank you for listening.